But for more on the news ecosystem, I'm joined in the newsroom by Meg Martin. Meg is a longtime journalist, most recently with NPR, sounds familiar, and she's now Associate Director of the Minnesota Journalism Center at the University of Minnesota. If you have a question, by the way, this is to the right to Axel, stand up here and wave. This is Axel, my great colleague here. Axel is going to stand. This is a vintage microphone that we brought in. So if you have a question for Meg or during our discussions here today, come on over and ask and stand in line and ask your question there. And with that, please welcome Meg Martin.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you. I am delighted to be here. I'm part of the team that's relaunching the Minnesota Journalism Center. Let's see if that works. Whoop, there we go. At the Hubbard School at the University of Minnesota. The Journalism Center has been around for about 40 plus years in several different iterations, but these days we're focused on three main areas. One of them is students, so we partner with news organizations around the state to connect our students to help kind of fill coverage gaps that they've identified. Research, so which is the thing we're going to talk about today, our team does applied research, so it's basically focused on helping journalists in Minnesota better serve their communities. And then the third piece, which is the newest for us, but is the piece that I work most closely with, is we support journalists across the state. We connect folks with training and mentorship and research cohorts, and of course our students, and most importantly with each other. So this is something that we're building. We're very new in this stage, but that to me is one of the most important parts is connection. Happy to talk about any of those things. We do have a table out there afterwards, so come on over. But really today, I'm here to share my colleague Ben Toff's research on the news and information ecosystem here in Minnesota. Ben's the director of the Minnesota Journalism Center. He's a researcher and professor at the U. He couldn't be here today. He's really sorry to miss you, but that's why you've got me. I am not a researcher. I have been a journalist for about 20 years, about a decade of that here in Minnesota. And when I looked at what Ben and his team have kind of uncovered, a lot of it felt really familiar to me. So for the journalists in the room, some of this is going to be exactly what you would expect to see, but there were some surprises. So I hope that there's something in this for everyone to sort of take home and kind of think about. This is obviously a critical moment for journalism in Minnesota and around the country. And so there are basically three big things. There's a lot of information out there, and there are a lot of studies. This is just one of them. Three things I want you to take away about our local news. Whoop. There, three things. Let's just see them. There we go. Okay. Three things that I want you to take away from about the local news and information ecosystem here in the state. And the first thing is that we are not immune to the forces that are at play everywhere else in this industry. We know this very deeply here in Minnesota. There have been threats to free speech, closures, layoffs, news avoidance, economic uncertainties, all of the things, right? We're not immune from any of that. But the second piece is that we are also inventing and reinventing. Minnesota, as you also probably know, has a really strong tradition here in every type of media for creating it. Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. For creating the types of news and information that meets people's needs. And then the third piece is sort of a combination of those other two, which is that I believe that we have the ingredients to be a model for the rest of the country, but we really need each other to make that happen. I often say to Ben, like, listen, if it's not going to happen here, it's not going to happen anywhere. I don't know if that's actually true. We're, trying to figure that out. But I do believe that we have a really huge opportunity in this moment, in this state. And so the picture in Minnesota, pretty nuanced, as you'll see, but it's also pretty singular. So a while back, here we go. Ben and the team realized there actually wasn't a reliable source of data on the availability of local news in Minnesota and also where news organizations are located. And this is across the spectrum of offerings of news. So being researchers, they decided to create their own data set. And so they started in 2018, gathering information in 2018, so that they could have a sense of what that pandemic effect may have been, and also a pretty solid baseline. The data collection, this is an ongoing project. The data collection continues today. They actually released their first report in 2024, but this is all updated information that we're looking at right now. It just came out in September. So the purpose of the research here was to build this baseline understanding, to understand something about the health of Minnesota's local news ecosystem. So how many local news organizations are there in the state? Where are they located? And then how are they changing over time? Today, we're going to look at the very, very first part of phase one. The thing that actually really surprised me, and again, I've been working in local news here for about 10 years. We have 600 local news outlets across Minnesota. That was really stunning to me. I don't know if that's surprising to anybody else in the room. Is that surprising? No, I don't know. I guess I figured with maybe a couple hundred here and there, whatever, but 600 seemed like a lot. And that is serving 6 million people who live here in the state. And also, as you can see on the map, they are all across the state, which is pretty remarkable. And is also not common in other places. In a lot of places, a lot of other states, you can see concentrations of news organizations in metro areas and then kind of a smattering here and there, but nothing like that. So that to me was really surprising. And I should also clarify that when we say local news outlets, we don't just mean a local radio or TV station or a local newspaper or website. We also mean your local independent journalist or independent media organization that's sharing news with your community. We want this to be as full a picture as possible. And we know that people get information from lots and lots of different sources. So there's a link right there, and I'll share more links at the end, but we're regularly updating this. So if you go to that link and you notice that there's an important news source in your area that is not on that map, there's a giant button for you to let us know. Please let us know, because we want this to be as full a picture as possible. So I should also say that there is a lot that just looking at the existence and location of outlets does not tell us about the health of local news ecosystem. We know how many organizations we've tracked, we know where they are, but what we don't know, how many people work at those organizations? What's their business structure? We also don't know, and this is the part that's really important to us, is what's being covered? What's not being covered? Where is the solutions work? Where's the government accountability work coming from? Where are the investigative efforts coming from? What about the explanatory work, et cetera, et cetera? So that we don't know yet. We also don't yet know who is being served. Is what's being produced meeting people's information needs? Where are their gaps? And very importantly, who's being left out of the conversation? These are all questions that we hope to answer in the next couple of years of this research. So it's ongoing. And this is all really important because when we talk about healthy news ecosystems, we're really talking about healthy communities. Healthy communities that are vibrant and resilient and engaged and that have a shared sense of place and meaning, context. I mean, think of truly anything that you care about here in Minnesota. And the ability of any of those things to be successful really requires access to reliable and trustworthy information, often local information. So in the big picture, it is true that there are closures and shrinking staffs, which, as we know, can lead to a massive reduction in the amount of original journalism being done in any place, and specifically here. But there are also new things happening that are beginning to fill those gaps. We have new news outlets. We have more independent journalists and creators all around the state. And there are a lot of people now also who might not consider themselves journalists who are stepping in to fill gaps. So maybe they're writing a local newsletter and curating information. Maybe they're volunteering with documenters to sit in on public meetings in Minneapolis. Maybe they're shooting photos for their community weekly. Or maybe there are students. So we have some students who, for instance, in this little pilot project we did last year, were covering the legislature for a couple dozen news outlets all around the state who didn't have access to legislative coverage. Every single one of those groups and individuals plays a role. They're not the same, but they're really important pieces of the ecosystem in different ways. So let's get to those takeaways. Okay. So that first thing, we're not immune. We're not immune to the forces inside and outside of the industry, nationally, globally. We all know this. You can clearly see the impacts of this even just in the past few months here in Minnesota. Layoffs, we've had closures, we've had cutbacks, canceled programming, and news organizations are having to make really hard decisions. Shrink footprints, maybe publish less regularly, maybe work with kind of a diminished editorial capacity, but also still working really hard to serve your community. And then, of course, there are outside forces like economic forces, technology, shifting habits. We know all of this stuff. Mis and disinformation, political polarization, news avoidance, which is another thing that our team studies, threats to free speech, funding cuts, and then, competition for funding and support and members and readers sometimes. And then, of course, business models that are struggling to be sustainable. So since 2018, when they've been measuring, as they've been measuring these outlets, we've had 97 local news organizations close in Minnesota. So that's about 12 per year, just under 16%. Those closures have primarily been in print. And the rate, the good news is that the rate kind of went up during the pandemic, but it went down, which is great. But now we're starting to see it rise up again. And so we're tracking that really closely. The closures primarily have been clustered around the Twin Cities, but when they happen in more rural parts of the state, they're mostly local papers that are closing. And also more than 80% of the closures have been commercial news organizations. So primarily kind of reflected in the local papers. The other thing that was really interesting that we're keeping an eye on, and we're not totally sure what this means quite yet, is that we've learned that there's a link between ownership changes and closures. So there have been 74 ownership changes. Now, this goes back to 2014. So in the past decade-ish, there have been 74 ownership changes of news organizations. And of those, more than a third have closed since then. So that's another thing, kind of a factor that we're keeping an eye out for. But we know that that seems to be kind of a tenuous time. So let's look at the state itself. Take a look, find your county. One of the things I learned is that pretty much every Minnesotan can identify their county and the shape of their county from like 100 miles away, which I totally respect and appreciate. I am not from Minnesota, so this is all new to me, but you can find your county. What we have found is that there are actually technically no news deserts in Minnesota as they're typically defined, which is really great. That doesn't mean everyone's being served, but it does mean that there are no news deserts quite yet. There are, as you might imagine, that little dark spot in the middle. There's a cluster of news outlets in the Twin Cities, and especially broadcasters. The cluster of broadcasters is there in the Twin Cities. But I should also say, there's that gray county, kind of in western central Minnesota. That's Wilkin County, and they're served primarily by the Wahpeton newspaper in North Dakota. So they're not a news desert because they're right on the border. But there's blue on every part of that map, which is pretty amazing. Different shades, but blue. So unlike in many other states, local news organizations here, they're spread all across the state to a pretty significant degree, and that's really, really good news. When we kind of zoom in just a little bit, it's probably worth knowing how this kind of plays out proportionally. Hennepin and Ramsey County, which are those really dark little section, the dark blue over in the kind of south. Well, you know where we are. I don't need to. Sorry, I am describing where we literally are at this moment. Welcome. So about a third of the state's population-ish lives in Hennepin and Ramsey counties alone, and they're served by about a third of local news organizations. So it's pretty proportional, which is nice. But when you zoom out just a tick, and you start to look at the counties around Hennepin and Ramsey in the Twin Cities metro area, that's another about third of the population of the state. They're served by only 8% of local news organizations. So we're still kind of looking into that, like what does that mean, and what does that mean in terms of access? But then if you zoom out to the full state, and you see the kind of the final third-ish of the population of Minnesota is outside the Twin Cities in greater Minnesota. And that group of the population is served by almost 60% of local news organizations, which is not proportional, but is also really great news in lots of ways. So we have a lot of questions about kind of how that proportionality breaks down. It's different in different parts of the state. So that's been really interesting to us also. When you think back to the closures, though, and the impacts of those closures, if we think about even just some examples from this year, I started looking at Western Minnesota. And Western Minnesota has really borne the brunt of a lot of closures this past year. In February, the Crookston Daily Times folded. And the Crookston Daily Times was founded in 1885. And that's up there in northwestern Minnesota. In May, just a couple months later, 4 newspapers closed: the Gonvick Leader Record, the Grigley Eagle, the Red Lake County Herald, and the McIntosh Times, all closed. A couple months later, down in southwestern Minnesota, 4 more papers closed: the Fulda Free Press, the Murray County News, the Murray County Advantage, and the Nobles County Review. They're not the only papers or news organizations that folded this year, but I think it's just worth kind of looking at the western part of that state and noticing that, they've lost a significant amount of local news sources. With those last kind of bit of closures, the South Dakota News Media Association director told a reporter, he said, "It could happen to anyone because I tell you, for the most part, the bottom line for most any news organization or newspaper here is razor thin." He said they're not swimming in deep cash flows, and it's a challenge, and there are a lot of headwinds, especially for community news organizations. So there's that risk that, sure, things seem like they're pretty okay for now for a lot of news organizations and independent journalists around the state. But what happens if a recession comes? What happens if the local economy in a particular area takes a hit in some way? Could that have an impact on the local news offerings in any place? Maybe, we don't know. So we're watching all of that. And then there are also these outside economic issues. This is not part of our research for lots of different reasons. It just doesn't show up in this map. But I also think it's worth noting because it's been in the headlines. We've written about it on our website. But many of you know this summer that federal funding was cut from public media organizations. And you also know that those federal funding cuts can be really devastating, especially for smaller stations and tribal media. In Minnesota, we have about 12.5 public radio and television stations that were affected. And so that's from small tribal and community stations to regional and statewide organizations. They lost millions in funding. In 2024, those stations had been collectively allocated about $17 million. So we've already seen layoffs and programming cuts and really hard decisions at some of those places. And what we know more generally about local news, and particularly in an environment like Minnesota, is that when one organization scales back and makes cuts, it doesn't just leave gaps in coverage for that organization's audience. News organizations here, we share our stories. Reporters show up on each other's organization's air and on their pages and sometimes on their social media. Photos are published and republished because we have sharing agreements. So every gap is amplified when cuts happen. People feel it. And I suspect we'll continue to feel those ripple effects as well. But there's some really good news too. Whoops. Okay, that worked. There's creation, there's reinvention, and there's a long history and tradition of that here in Minnesota. You know this too. There is good news that exists with these tough realities, and this is the part where I think things get really interesting. So I told you I'm not from Minnesota. I moved here about a decade ago, and from the start it was very clear to me that this place just crackles. It's really interesting. I had never been to a place like this. There's great energy, particularly in the local news scene, and it's got this long history of being a place where people find ways to serve their communities in lots of different ways. And it turns out that the numbers bear that out. So our research has told us that since 2018, at least 41 local news outlets have opened across the state. That's pretty incredible. Let's clap for that. Absolutely. Thank you. And so that makes the closure to opening rate about 2 to 1. That's pretty good. 97 closures for 41 launches. 5 of those 41 outlets that have launched since 2018 serve specific cultural communities, which is double the rate of foundings across the entire ecosystem. And it's also worth knowing that there's a lot of stability in college and broadcast media. So we'll continue to watch to see if all those things bear out. But I think all of those pieces are hopeful news. Another thing that's really interesting to look at is the types of news outlets in the state and the way that it breaks down. So more than 3/4 of local news in Minnesota is produced by commercial outlets, which you probably know, which is broadcast television, your local paper, and 17.5% is produced by either nonprofit or what we would consider to be public serving government media. But let's just a breakdown. All right, sorry. Oh, no! Oh, I'm just skipping them. Oh, y'all, I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll just watch a scroll here. Oh, okay. When you look at the closures and launches, thank you. When you look at the closures and launches and you really zoom in there, what you're seeing is that almost a quarter of the new outlets being founded are nonprofits. So it's a growing sector of local news here in the state, which we kind of assumed when we went into this research, but it's really interesting to see that play out. You can also see from the data, though, that all kinds of organizations are building things. Across the state, and they've been doing it for years. MinPost is what, like 20 years old? Is that right? MinPost? 18. Okay, almost 20 years old. Pretty incredible. North News has been around for almost 30 years, for more than 30 years, right? NPR is almost 60. So, and then we have all these new organizations. Eden Prairie Local News, just a few years old. Iron Range Today is still in the launch. Sahan Journal, which just celebrated 6 years from its founding. And then there are organizations like the Central Minnesota News Collaborative, which is a new partnership between Project Optimist and the St. Cloud Smalley Community Radio. So things are being built. And then, of course, there are so many independent journalists and producers who have identified information needs and communities that need serving, and they're reaching folks across the state. So there are individuals who have stepped up to be eyes and ears, et cetera. This summer, the editor of the Grigla paper that closed that I told you about, she started a new website called The Northern Neighbor that is now helping to fill some gaps in her community. And just this week, there was a really great piece on NPR about the Warren Sheaf, which is a newspaper in western Minnesota that is a rare story of sort of a local paper's publisher finding someone to take over the paper. I'm talking a lot about new organizations, but obviously, as Tom mentioned before, let's not forget that Minnesota is home to some pretty incredible newspapers, television stations, online-only news sites, and radio stations that have really formed the backbone and sort of the foundation of our news and information ecosystem for decades, for a really, really long time. And they're recognized nationally as very often as the best and strongest local and regional news organizations. We know that too. They've evolved and changed over the years. And so there's invention, there's experimentation, reflection. It's happening at every level. And I think a really important thing to note is that we're doing a lot of that work together in collaborative projects, story sharing agreements, et cetera. We see that every day at the MJC, and we're working to foster that too. And so that gets to the last piece, which is sort of a combination of the first two. Oh, this could be, okay, there we go. I really think we're primed. I think we're ready. We have all the ingredients to be a model for the rest of the country. I look at this data, I take what I know from my own experience, and I think we can do it. We know that a lot of the changes have left many communities' access to reliable, trustworthy information diminished. And we also know, and it's really important not to forget, that there are plenty of communities in Minnesota who have never had access to reliable, trustworthy local news and information. And when we're talking about a healthy ecosystem for local news and for information, what we're really talking about is healthy communities. And Minnesota's exceptional, which I know we love to talk about here, but I really can't think of another state whose local news environment is anything like this. We have strong legacy news organizations, we have established collaborations, new organizations emerging, independent producers identifying and filling gaps, and there have been a lot of nimble approaches, experimentation, and we know that listeners, readers, and community members are willing to regularly support us, and they're enthusiastic about the work of journalism. There are funders, grant makers, and a lot of people in this room who are equally enthusiastic about the work of journalism. And we also have a lot of opportunities and needs to fill, communities to reach, gaps, all of the things, all the ingredients that are ready for now. So I think the conditions are right here for this really critical, tenuous, but exciting moment. And I think it's going to take all of us. We all have a role to play. And hopefully this helps you start to think about maybe what your own role might be in all of this. So thank you very much.
Before you leave, Meg, I want to show a video that we did over at the Minneapolis Community and Technical College, asking students there how they find out what's happening in the world.
How do I find out what's going on in the world? I would say mostly random social media things. I mean, it could be TikTok, Instagram, any of those short form contents, and YouTube still.
Bit embarrassing to say, but honestly, a lot of the stuff that hits my feed right away is from Twitter, social media. Also, my partner reads a lot of news and is very tapped in. So usually anything that happens, it's like he tells me first, and then I'm like, oh my God. And then I'll look into it later. But usually, yeah, either social media or just like the people around me.
I get most of my news from the internet. Instagram threads or X is a big one.
Are there specific channels or news sources you look for?
Not really, unless I find something interesting. I mean, Star Tribune's a big one for me.
Oh, well, I actually read the news. I seek out the news. I have apps, watch the news daily. CNN. I know it's biased. Washington Post, New York Times, the credited ones. I think they're credited at least.
What about, do you watch, I don't know, like local TV news? Do you do that much?
No, I actually don't. Yeah.
Newspapers, magazines, or is it mostly just online?
It's mostly just online, yeah. Sometimes if I see a link to an article, I'll click on that and like read through it, but that's usually presented to me on an app or through a person, yeah.
I don't think I've carried physical media in years.
I don't have a specific channel I always watch. I'll say if there's something that I'm interested in, I might dig more in that. I can start on Google and just go to like normal stuff that I'm familiar with, like CNN or Fox. Now, okay, maybe it's a little more legit. But other than that, I just scroll and see what's trending.
X, Instagram, Facebook is kind of where I think my generation is getting most of their information these days.
Do you watch the local TV news at 5 o'clock?
Occasionally. I would say about once a week I'm watching like a live newscast.
The social media as like a news source can be a bit rocky because it's like, yes, so many people have access to it, but who's verifying it? Versus like a news source like New York Times, they have something to lose if they have like a full story.
So Meg, you have taught at the U and you've talked to students about some of that stuff. So what are your reflections on seeing that and what you experience at the U?
Well, I mean, it tracks. It doesn't sound unfamiliar at all. I mean, I think I taught a podcasting class last year, and we talked about this on the first day, like where are you getting information, where are you getting your news? And, you know, a lot of students said pretty much, I mean, you could have put that up on the video, right? But then we started talking about the difference between a source and a platform, you know, because a lot of people say, oh, social media, right? But social media is a platform. And a lot of news organizations are putting their information out there, and maybe it's getting remixed or maybe it's getting kind of reinterpreted. But to me, that felt more like an opportunity, maybe, than anything else. It didn't make me cringe as much as maybe it should. I don't know.
Well, so if you see the next slide here, a story from Neiman this summer that talked about how, for the first time ever, social media overtakes TV as the top news source. But to what you were just saying, you're actually saying it's the top platform.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the same news sources aren't existing. They're just existing somewhere else.
Right. Like what I would love to dig into, and maybe I'm sure this story actually does dig into it, but what I would love to dig into is like where actually on social media are people getting information and who are their kind of trusted conduits.
Meg Martin, I want to thank you from the Minnesota Journalism Center. Let's give her a round of applause. She's out back and we'll be visiting.